for the prohibition of chemical weapons, adding that Brussels and London's accusations are actually putting the internationally recognized body into doubt. On Monday, the EU issued an extremely cautious joint statement over the incident, something picked up on by Moscow. RT's Igor Zhdanov has more on the European reaction.
The EU issued a joint and a very careful statement on the whole case of the poisoning, of the Skripal poisoning. They did not pin the blame on Russia, but they expressed their grave alertness, their grave worry about the whole thing. They've said that they are treating the incident very, very seriously, and they've said that the use, I quote, of chemical weapons by anyone under any circumstances is completely unacceptable. And they've demanded some more information from Russia, effectively, because a lot of countries are pinning the blame on Russia for it. French President Emmanuel Macron even included one into his congratulatory message to Vladimir Putin. NATO also weighed in on this. Have a listen.
We continue to call on Russia to provide complete disclosure of the Novichok program.
Our expectations for Russia to address the questions raised by the UK and the international community and to provide disclosure of its program to the OPCW.
Britain is acting in punctilious accordance with our obligations under the Treaty on Chemical Weapons, and I would contrast that with how the Russians are behaving.
Russia has been expressing its eagerness to cooperate with the investigation. They've repeated it a number of times. They've filed an official request for samples of the nerve agent used to poison Skripal to be provided to Russia for analysis to find out where it's coming from, where it could be coming from, who may have produced this sample. None of the official requests of Russia have been fulfilled. Instead, there's been a barrage of accusations and of demands. Russia explains itself.
Despite the probe into the poisoning of Sergei Skripal and his daughter still ongoing, media were extremely quick to blame Russia, as RT's Jacqueline Vugo reports.
The West is in no doubt. Russia tried to poison one of its ex-agents on Putin's orders. But if true, that's actually a bit embarrassing. Professional assassins cover their tracks. They don't leave their fingerprints all over the scene. Yet that's what using a nerve agent produced only in the Soviet Union essentially amounts to, at least if it was the Russians. On top of this, the assassination bid looks like it was a botched job, with collateral damage. And it's attracting an intense amount of global scrutiny. Presumably, that was not what was intended, and not what you'd expect from a slick, all-powerful Secret Service, Russian or not. And yet...
Outrageous and illegal act on British soil, an attack on the United Kingdom.
New generation warfare against the West.
The increasingly violent and erratic approach of outrageous act.
Contempt of Britain, contempt of the rule of law, and contempt of our values.
So which is it, bumbling idiots or super spies? If we look back, it seems the answer to that question can be tailored to fit the situation. Take the alleged hacking of the U.S. presidential election. Washington called the operation sophisticated, an attack the likes of which have never been seen before.
Russia's blatant interference in the United States 2016 presidential elections.
Many have said this is actually the crime of the century.
Do you have any doubt that Russian interference is driven by Putin himself?
No doubt.
And yet those sophisticated attackers didn't make the slightest effort to hide their locations. Any Tom, Dick, or Harry can throw their IP address to make it look like they're based anywhere in the world. And yet, all the IP addresses were Russian. A similar situation was seen in Germany not long before their national election took place. Again, the conclusion was that Moscow was behind the hack because the IP addresses originated in Russia. However, we've seen the exact opposite as well. When South Korean government computers were the targets of cyber attacks during the Winter Olympics, the IP addresses used were from inside North Korea. But it was determined the hackers were Russians. They were simply masking their locations this time around. Damned if you do, damned if you don't.
You know, everything that goes wrong must be Russia. We have our police saying that actually it's going to take months to try and work out what happened, build the evidential chain. And yet on another hand as well, we have the British media immediately stampeding to say it must be the Kremlin, it must be Russia. So this strange mishmash of speculation, is very distressing to someone who used to work on the inside. I would say as well that people like me have been challenging this narrative in the UK media for the last 2 weeks, ever since the attack happened.
And the list could go on, but the point is the Western narrative doesn't care if Russian intelligence is smart or dumb or anything in between. It only has to be one thing, and that thing is guilty.
It is exactly 15 years since the United States began an operation it called Iraqi Freedom, commonly known as the Iraq War. And what began as a promise to liberate a country from a dictator turned into years of conflicts all across the region. Here's a reminder of how it all unfolded.
Less than a teaspoonful of dry anthrax in an envelope shut down the United States Senate. Iraq declared 8,500 liters of anthrax.
Many Iraqis can hear me tonight in a translated radio broadcast, and I have a message for them. The tyrant will soon be gone. The day of your liberation is near.
Tonight, I am announcing that the American combat mission in Iraq has ended. It will take time to eradicate a cancer like ISIL. We will conduct a systematic campaign of airstrikes against these terrorists.
What's concerning is people who are caught in the crossfire. Those innocent people of Mosul are the ones who require dire humanitarian assistance.
One of the darkest pages in the war was the exposure of the torture of Iraqi detainees at the Abu Ghraib prison. A warning, you may find the following images disturbing. RT has spoken to former Abu Ghraib prisoners who described their ordeal.
When the Americans arrived with their tanks, we thought they would rid us of the harsh regime. Everyone would have their own house and car, just like in the wealthy Arab countries or in the West. But it turns out to be the opposite.
They would hang a prisoner on the metal door of the cell and subject him to electrocution or urination. They would stick a rifle into sensitive areas, or they would use a broken broomstick, causing internal bleeding. Prisoners would need surgery.
After I was released, whenever I saw Americans on the street, I would be terrified they would send me back to that place and torture me again. It still keeps me up at night remembering the torture. I hear the screams.
The time I spent in that prison felt like a lifetime. An hour of that pain, humiliation, and injustice stays with you forever.
I still have nightmares and suffer physical and mental pain, as if it all happened yesterday. I work night and day to try to forget it. What we went through and what happened to Iraq was a terrible crime. It broke us. Even now I can't get inside a bathtub because it makes me think of waterboarding.
One Iraqi MP told us they first welcomed the toppling of Saddam Hussein, but then the invasion brought one catastrophe after another.
It's a mixture feeling of happiness and joy, because that invasion removed Saddam Hussein from power and freed people. But on the other hand, what followed after the removal of the regime is a disaster after disaster. Because the American invasion immediately created an absolute vacuum in the security, in the economy, and in politics in Iraq. And transformed the country from absolute dictatorship to freedom without limits, freedom without responsibilities.
The UK is seeking a warrant to search the servers of data mining